I'm going to talk to you about emerging business models from the 3D printing community. This is quite new research. We just about made it into a journal which is going to be published early next year. So this is some kind of premiere that you're getting here from me. A little of background. We started as a very transdisciplinary conference here, and I myself, I'm sort of quite transdisciplinary. Sort of very familiar with the industrial engineering part that's happening here. I used to connect big robots to big CNC machines, but that was like 20, 25 years ago. So I was part of this, which used to be called computer integrated manufacturing revolution we had at that time. Sounds awfully familiar to Industry 4.0. We had all those robots and all these automation projects, and everybody had also then the fear that all jobs would disappear. The only job that actually disappeared at that factory was my job, once all the automation projects had been done. I ventured through academia and consultancy for basically all my life, spent time in artificial intelligence, and also did have a sort of more artistic career, which I think we're a little bit missing here at this university. I worked as a light and sound designer for a theater company. But let me move on to the topic of 3D printing. And I first thought, you must have seen that video over and over again. But then when I checked it again yesterday, when preparing my presentation, I noticed this is really a historical moment to show you that video, because it has disappeared from YouTube. It's in two other ways a historical moment. What the machine is printing here is the infamous Stanford bunny, a 1994 3D model, which is really kind of at the very beginning of 3D modeling, and is printed over and over and over again. So probably at the Open Lab, you're going to print a couple of 3D Stanford bunnies over the next few weeks. Printing time is about 14 hours, I've been told. And the other historical moment about this machine that we're seeing here, obviously this is the MakerBot. This is the machine that MakerBot got big with, the Thingomatic. Remember back in 2009, MakerBot was funded. That was just when we started to think about 3D printing, except those people in industrial engineering who knew 3D printing had been around for 30 years at that time. 3D printing also stands for, and that sort of links back to the computer integrated manufacturing and fourth industrial revolution topic. 3D printing stands as the icon of the current industrial revolution, as was the steam engine the icon for the first industrial revolution, and the conveyor belt, obviously, for the second industrial revolution. And I'm following here the argumentation of Jeremy Rifkin, who's arguing that the first and the second industrial revolutions really were about centralized hierarchical systems, and that's how we learned business and companies are organized. That's how we think about organizations, that's how we think about universities, that's how we think about corporates. It's all hierarchical and centralized. And Jeremy Rifkin argues, and I guess the topic of this conference is in the same line of argument, that the industrial revolution that we're experiencing now is moving away from horizontal, from vertical centralized structures and moving to collaborative, horizontal, lateral networked structures. Jumping into technology for a moment, because the rest of my presentation will then be strictly in business administration, jumping between disciplines at the moment. This is the famous Gartner hype curve, and I believe you've seen that over and over and over again for anything in technology. Just to remind you, 3D printing appeared with Gartner at around 2008 for the first time, moving up to the infamous peak of inflated expectations in 2012, 2013, around the time that MakerBot made great successes, came out with a Replicator 2, and moved from their open source principle that they used in the Thingomatic approach to the closed source Replicator 2, then in 2013 got bought up by Stratasys. In 2013, Gartner noticed that 3D printing is not a unitary thing, but that they should maybe divide it into consumer 3D printing and enterprise 3D printing. And interestingly, in 2014, they pushed consumer 3D printing in the trough of disillusionment. That was really, you know, the newspapers were still full of ideas that everybody will have a 3D printer at home and print everything and anything they could, which still has not happened, and is probably not going to happen for the next 30 years. I'm not showing you the next Gartner hype curve, 2015 and 2016, because what they started to do at Gartner is unravel 3D printing in various technologies, application, processes, etc., etc., etc. So you will find 25, 30 dots all across that, that hype curve thing. But because 3D printing inspired journalists, inspired business people, and inspired researchers, I used that as a platform to link to the business model question. Now, a business model, in its most simple definition, is the way how a company creates, distributes, and captures value. Now, it's a very useful definition for a textbook, and a very useless definition for a researcher or for a businessman. So we're looking into other definitions of business models, and also trying to link that to the theme of open. And indeed, we found that open had become an issue around 2010, 2011 in business model research, in strategy research, and particularly around the issue of Web 2.0. Where one group of researchers was saying the firm's customers are becoming an increasingly important source of information about the Web 2.0 changes, as evidenced by the growing relevance of user-added value and interaction orientation. In that context, researchers talk about the focal firm and the community they're interacting with. And when we read those papers, we see that there's a distinction, I would say, between what we then would call a community-oriented approach, say a central firm organizing their customers in some kind of community format, giving them some feedback platforms or interaction possibilities with the central firm. You know, the stuff that the Daimlers and the BMWs of this world are doing, or the KLMs and the Lufthansas with their sort of customer programs. And on the other hand, well, as you can see there, there's obviously a dilemma in that approach, because the central firm is sort of pursuing this traditional a vertical centralized approach, whereas a community, by definition almost, is something lateral networked. There are also approaches that we would call community-based, where the business model actually emerges from the community itself, and companies might emerge from within the community to build upon what the community is working on. And that's really what we were interested in. We also found that other researchers in business model research noticed that exactly in that sort of dilemma between centralized and networked, and in that question of how do we integrate outside forces into the firm's business model, there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of topics that we just don't know how it works. There's no theory how to explain it. So that's sort of the area we wanted to do some research. We were then at a point where we said, but hang on, this initial definition, a business model is the way how a company creates, distributes, and captures value, does not help to address those questions. Luckily, there were more researchers around there's one thing that was just published this summer, open models and closed-loop chains. Kortman and Frank Piller trying to make sense from that thing, and they're defining sort of a matrix that looks at the value chain, forward-oriented or closed-loop oriented, from production, consumption to circulation, and various levels of, say, openness or aggregation, looking at the firm that's pretty close, the alliance, or the platform. And then, you know, you can fill in the matrix and you've got 9 dots and you can talk about the dots. But still, we wanted to look inside the dots, not just organize the dots in a nice engineering or business administration way. So eventually, we found a paper by Zoltan Ahmet, who look at the business model as an activity system. So they're really trying to look into the business model. And so the business model is described as the system of activities performed by the focal firm as well as by third parties. Could be partners, could be suppliers, could be customers, could be the community in our case, with 2 sets of design parameters. And these design parameters are what Zoltan Ahmet call these design elements that describe an activity system's architecture. These are the content, the structure, and the governance. And design themes. Design themes are essentially the mechanisms of creating value, and there are 4, according to Zoltan Ahmet: novelty, lock-in, complementarity, and efficiency. It's kind of self-explanatory, I guess, what they're thinking of. Just a footnote, sort of linking to the discussions that we're going to have after my keynote. There's the word governance in the design elements, and I think that's an aspect we have been looking not closely enough at in recent research. Because, for instance, IP regimes, closed or open, are actually governance regimes in that sense. So, we were trying to find a place to look for some empirical data or evidence. We could have looked at the plastic value chain, we could have looked at the creative sector, we could have looked at electronics development, we could have looked at healthcare, because in all those sectors, this transition from vertical centralized to horizontal lateral networked is actually happening. But we chose the 3D printing environment particularly because there is this thing called Thingiverse. Thingiverse is a platform where creators can document and share 3D designs. It was initially set up also in 2009 by the guys who set up MakerBot. And because it has been around for quite some time, there is a little bit of research into what is going on Thingiverse and so on. So we could use that as a basis to actually sample a number of people from Thingiverse. We selected 60 creators on Thingiverse who had the most reused models on Thingiverse. We then looked at those 60 people and said, okay, we want to look into business models, so we need to have people in the sample who actually do have a business model. So we found 25 out of these creators on Thingiverse who actually did have some kind of business. We did a quick look at the salient business model, sort of saying, what is he doing? Oh, he's selling 3D prints. What is he doing? Oh, he's 3D modeling for others. Which resulted in 5 categories. I'll show them in a second. Said, okay, we need at least 3 per category, gives us 15. 8 of them agreed to be interviewed. And we then sort of, in each interview, asked, do you know anybody else we should be asking about that? Which eventually led to 11 interviews carried out. We did obviously a data analysis of the Thingiverse profiles and the company websites. We held interviews via Skype, had us talk them through their process from idea to business. And I think at this moment it's wise for me to acknowledge the work that a student of ours had put into that, Laura Guggiari, from the University of Applied Sciences in Lucerne, Switzerland. We looked at talked them through the design of the business model, design themes, did a lot of recording, transcription, 146 pages, coding, cross-case analysis, kind of standard social science approach. These are the sort of salient business models we had. 3D printing for others, selling 3D prints, say on Etsy or something like that. We had guys like, this is an example here from Hamburg, guys, not in our sample, but just to sort of give you the impression, guys who run a 3D printer shop, guys who did 3D scanning of people as a service. Fan art was one example that we found. Something into sort of the more researchy and educational thing, archaeological models and thingiverse to illustrate that. Or the case of Ultimaker, which still is an open source 3D printer and is trying to use the community of its users to improve the product. So that's the lens we looked at the cases we found. And well, in here, there was nothing so really exciting. We thought, okay, most of those business models these guys are using are kind of standard, what we would have expected from not community-based business models, except in the last column, actually the governance models you see in the second row, we found that people who sold other people's designs decided to give the original designers a share of the sales price, which in a traditional design world would not be exceptional, but in the community-based design world, where you put your design on Thingiverse with the message, be happy and use it, you don't have to pay me, is sort of an interesting moment that, okay, those people understand how communities work. And similarly in the research education, maybe not so surprisingly that their knowledge sharing and the community itself were at the core. We also looked at the design themes. Again, not so much a surprise. Most of them, it's in 3D printing, so 3D printing is a novel thing, so the main mechanism to earn money with 3D printing is because it's new. But we found altruism and altruism/hedonism coming up in the interviews as sort of an underlying mechanism, not to make money, but to create value, which would lead us in a discussion of what we understand under value. But I'm going to skip that for the moment, leave that for the discussions. The interesting thing, and you know, if you look at the most left-hand column, the numbers don't add up. We had only 11 interviews. So the interesting thing here was that except two of them, namely number 3 and number 10, all of them operated various business models simultaneously. So actually they were operating a whole portfolio of business models. Now there can be a lot of speculation why they would be doing that. One speculation could be that one single business model would just not generate enough money to sustain themselves. But we could also argue that it's exactly the interplay between the business models that is characteristic for that lateral network type of environment that we're in. And the other thing is that some idea of sharing altruism, hedonism based, one or the other, or sometimes both, appeared in 8 of the 11 interviews. Maybe that's just an artifact because we started from the community, and there is this sharing ethos in the community that they came back. Reciprocity, fairness, governance came back again and again and again in the interviews as well. So the key takeaways are threefold. First, we found that business model portfolio. Second, we found sharing emerging as a design theme next to the other ones like novelty, lock-in, etc. And we found that reciprocity and fairness emerge as governance principles, which really ties in with Rifkin and Ostrom's arguments about economies of the commons. We need to go further. We need to go further in two directions. One is, yeah, we looked at business models as activity systems, but still, I feel this is too shallow. We need to dig deeper. So I'm planning to approach the same data with a different lens, with an activity theory lens, to really dig deeper into the activity structures of those business models. And the other is obviously that we have to take it broader and look into various other industries. And as I mentioned before, there are many other industries that are in these transitions from the plastic packaging to healthcare to electronics development. So there's an awful lot of very exciting work to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Troxler. We are open for questions. Okay, Sonja.
Wait for the microphone, please.
First of all, thank you very much. It's very interesting. I just wonder, how do you define a community? Because you've been speaking about community-based and community-oriented research, and then when I look at your data sample, you are basically referring to a virtual community of practice. And this is actually a bit different from what we heard earlier, where they really focus on local, regional communities.
Indeed.
So
Indeed.
Are you considering both, or just this virtual community of practice?
That is a big discussion that we had, particularly with the editors of the journal where we're publishing, because indeed there are very different notions what the community is. In ethnography, it's completely different than in what we would call what I would call internet studies. Yeah. And a lot of business literature, when looking at Web 2.0 applications, are talking about the communities in the sense of internet studies. So they talk about a Thingiverse community, a Facebook community, that kind of thing. And that's, I understand, that's problematic with using the term community-based. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
So if you would have a suggestion what else to use, because
but I always get confused because a lot of people are using it differently than you just used it,
yep.
And so I always have to make sure that we share the same understanding.
No, absolutely, that's a point.
Because if you have the vision to think globally but act locally, so to collaborate globally but manufacture locally, then you have to have a slightly different understanding of a community. But if this is not behind your research, then
no, I guess in the think globally, act locally setting, where you would want to interconnect a global community of engineers, designers, what have you, with a local community of makers, producers, users, then you would actually have two types of communities interconnecting.
Yeah, that's what we have a research project, and that's what we do.
That's where it gets interesting.
We
yes.
we investigate like how these two types of communities
yep.
are actually
totally
interconnected.
Agree. Totally agree.
Yeah. Thank you.
You said you wanted to continue your research and have sort of certain assumptions. If you continue your research, do you suggest or do you suppose that there might be sort of different value structures if you investigate, let's say, electronics on the one hand and healthcare on the other?
You mean if I look at different sectors, I would encounter different value structures?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's totally true. You know, we could argue that this study, which is around that Thingiverse community, about the Thingiverse community, that we find hedonism as a value is maybe not so surprising. And in healthcare, we might find much more altruism, help others, enable others, that kind of thing. In electronics, we might find values of we want to improve the world, whatever improve then means. I think on a sort of more abstract level, it would be interesting to look into what other value systems are in operation in those various disciplines, and how does that interact with the sort of strictly monetary type of this is value creation idea.
Thanks. Thank you very much for your questions. I would have a last question for your talk. I mean, I don't know how many of you have already been to the Thingiverse platform before. Maybe you can give me a sign who has been on Thingiverse before. Okay. This platform, I've been there a couple of times, and it came to my mind when you talk about business models connected to this platform. I saw lots of products there that reminded me on gimmick-like products. So, like, you know, it's, yeah, gimmick. You know, I think this term is common, hopefully.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
What do you think? Do you see a development, since you were researching the platform, do you see development to more products that are more useful?
I'm not so familiar with the distribution of, you know, what is what on Thingiverse. I do relatively closely follow the data we get from 3D hubs, because they're analyzing in which area do they produce 3D prints. So from that, and it appears that the distribution over the years is roughly similar.
Okay.
And just to sort of address the term gimmicks you use, I mean, I showed the one model. This is often called fan art, and actually that's a really big one, and probably one of the most successful in terms of just realizing a business from it.
Right. Okay.
And also an interesting one because it links into our next discussion about the legal issues. Yeah. As long as we define it as fan art, it's fine. But when we start to mass produce fan art, and is 3D printing mass production, is it still fan art, or can the guy who does it be sued by the brand owner? So that's the bridge to